When your body is using nerves to coordinate a response, perhaps to a stimulus that is coming in, your body will pass the information along neurons. So we've got 3 neurons in this picture. We have sensory neurons. This is the sensory neuron here, and it stretches from the receptor past the nucleus along the axon to the nerve endings down the bottom. So a receptor will detect a stimulus. So there's a receptor, and it might pick up a stimulus, maybe pressure, and then a pressure receptor will talk to the sensory neuron, triggering an electrical impulse that gets passed along the sensory neuron. So the electrical impulse, if I colour that in blue, the electrical impulse will travel along the sensory neuron. It then reaches the central nervous system, and in the central nervous system you have cells called relay or interneurons, and that's this one here. And it does not have long axons. It has dendrites at one end that contact the sensory neuron, and it has nerve endings at the other side that contact the motor neuron. So in the central nervous system, that might include your brain or your spine, so the CNS, these interneurons pick up the sensory information and relay it to the motor neuron. So here is our motor neuron. Motor neuron is long and thin with its axon, picks up the information from the interneuron and passes it to an effector. So an effector can be a muscle or a gland or an organ that's acting like a gland. In this case it's a muscle, so we've got some muscle tissue here, so the effector is a muscle, and it will cause a change when the electricity passes along the neuron. It will cause a contraction in the muscle. So our electrical impulse has come from the receptor up here along the sensory neuron. It has been passed through the central nervous system, maybe the spine or the brain, and to a motor neuron where it passes down as an electrical signal to the effector, triggering a response. There is, if you've been carefully looking, one little extra bit that we need to think about. So we've thought about electrical signals, but we also need to think about the gaps between one neuron and the next. And these gaps are really important for control. They're called synapses, and this is where neurotransmitters, which are chemicals, diffuse from the end of one neuron and trigger an electrical signal to start in the next neuron. So we'll have a little look at synapses later on. This whole thing is called a reflex arc, but it's also what we use every day to detect stimulus and respond to it in a thoughtful way if we do more processing in the central nervous system. So let's have a look at the next image. So this is our individual cells with a little bit more detail for each one. So this is the sensory neuron. The direction of the electrical signal is shown in that with the blue arrow, and you'll notice that there is a long, thin axon, so that's the brown line here, and it is able to carry the information from the receptor along the cell in the direction of the arrow and out to the axon terminals or the nerve endings where there'll be a synapse connecting to the next neuron. The myelin sheath is really important. The myelin sheath is created by cells called Schwann cells that wrap themselves around the axon and cause the electrical signal to travel even faster down the axon. So this sensory neuron is connecting to something in the central nervous system, an interneuron. You can see it's much smaller, it doesn't have long axon, and it's going to receive information at the top in this diagram and pass it down to the next neuron, and the next neuron is the motor neuron. So this is the motor neuron. It's receiving information from the central nervous system here, and the electrical signal is going that way. Similarly, we have a myelin sheath similar to the sensory neuron, myelin sheath made by Schwann cells, which speed up the electrical signal. And what it actually does is make the electrical signal jump from exposed bit of axon to exposed bit of axon. So it can go even faster than if it had to travel along the whole axon piece by piece. So it's called saltatory conduction, which is jumping. So it's just speeding up the movement of the electrical signal. And then at this end, the synaptic endings connect to an effector and trigger a response, like releasing a hormone or contracting a muscle. Let's have a closer look at the gaps between one neuron and the next. So this is the incoming sensory information, and it's trying to pass on the information to an interneuron. And you'll notice there is a gap. This is a really, really small gap. It's called the synaptic cleft, and it is nanometers thick or wide. And you'll notice that there are a few interesting things happening. So in comes our electrical signal here, and this electrical signal is going to trigger exocytosis. So we've got exocytosis here, which is where these little vesicles that are full of neurotransmitter, they bind to the membrane on one side of the synapse, releasing their neurotransmitters into the gap. And these neurotransmitters are then picked up on specific receptors on the other side of the gap, and then the electrical signal is triggered, and the electrical signal carries on in the next neuron. So we've gone from electrical to chemical to electrical to chemical to electrical. And this synapse allows for a little bit of interference from other neurons, maybe overriding an automatic reaction, or allowing many pieces of information to come together, and then the brain can decide whether they're going to act in one way or another way by assimilating multiple pieces of information with neurotransmitters that promote the next neuron to fire, or maybe neurotransmitters that slow down the firing of the next neuron. Just adding some layers of control. The last thing we need to think about is how an electrical signal actually passes down an axon. And you'll remember from Module 1 that we are able to move ions into and out of cells. And this whole thing is a cell. So this is a cell. It looks weird because it's not just a normal cell shape of being round like a fried egg with a nucleus in the middle. It's got this long, thin axon, but that's because it's been specially shaped to carry out this job of transmitting nerve signals. But the whole thing is one cell, and that means that on the edge there is a cell membrane. So this is the cell membrane here, and that's what we've got here on this image. That edge piece is the cell membrane, and the yellow in the center, this is the cytoplasm. So in the cell membrane there are some carrier molecules. So you'll remember thinking about the cell membrane, you had phospholipids with little tails on them as a bilayer. It's not a great diagram, my pen's too fat. So we've got bilayer here, but then we've got these ion channels that are going from one side of the membrane to another. And it's possible to allow just sodium to pass through these ion channels. So when the electrical signal first comes, the ion channels open and sodium floods in to the cell. And this changes the charge in the cell. Because sodium is positive, so the inside becomes positive. And as the electrical signal moves down the axon, more sodium comes in, and then more sodium comes in as it moves to the right. So first of all it happens here, and then it happens here, and then it happens here. And that is what the electrical signal is, an inflowing of sodium ions. This now has to be reset so that the nerve can fire again, and that's what happens in these green sections here. It's reset by potassium being allowed out of the cell, so from the cytoplasm to the outside. So you'd use another ion channel, and this time you'd allow potassium out of the cell. So What you need to take away from this is that the electrical signal that moves along a nerve cell is actually generated by the movement of ions into the cell and then the movement of ions out of the cell later. I don't think you're going to need more information than that, but understanding that you can link that movement of ions to what you already know about cell membranes and about ion channels is really important.